So one, or maybe one of them, is an argument for God's existence that I'm familiar with is that the world can't be infinite. So in order for the world not to be infinite, there has to be an infinite creator, because then otherwise it would just keep going back and back, right?
Okay, to my mind, those words are absolute nonsense. That make no sense whatsoever.
I'm going to have trouble articulating it, but it is an argument. But it relies basically on the fact that the world just can't be infinite. Okay, I'm here. I want to ask, why can't the world be infinite? Why doesn't it make sense to say that the world could just be infinite?
It does make sense, and it's an open question in contemporary physics, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. End of story. End of story. I mean, the only charitable thing to say is, by the word infinite, they meant something else, and from what we mean by infinite. And that could be. We're talking about words that were written at least 800 years ago. We have a well-defined mathematical concept of infinity. It's a branch of mathematics. I've taught it, and we have no trouble with analyzing it. And the idea of there being an infinity of space is something which is an open question in contemporary.
That doesn't pose a threat to like faith or anything like that?
I don't know what they're talking about. You look it up in any encyclopedia, and you'll see whether it's an open universe, open or an infinite universe, or closed and finite universe, or asymptotic universe. It's an open cosmological question.
If there's an open universe and it just goes on forever and ever, doesn't that say that you don't necessarily need a creator?
No, one thing has nothing to do with the other. Absolutely nothing to do with the other. Sorry, yeah.
So we find in the recent parashas like several instructions for all sorts of procedures.
Yeah.
So my question is, do we have an idea why the order of each procedure, specifically in this case, like why the machatzita shekel is found exactly in between the procedures in which is found?
Well, no question that there are explanations for these things. We know there's a famous disagreement about whether the housing of the tabernacle should be before the vessels or the vessels before the housing. And we know that was a matter of dispute between Moses and Bezalel. And what is fascinating, which people aren't aware of, I heard it from my Rabbi here in Yerushalayim, that this agreement is that really the housing should be built first and the vessels afterwards. The vessels shouldn't sit out unhoused, right? But they did for 4 months, excuse me, because they finished all the construction and Hanukkah, and they didn't put it up until the beginning of Nisan. So the vessel sat out unhoused for 4 months. Hello, how are we going to explain that? So I have to think about that. Yeah, I'm sure there are reasons for that. I don't know them. I've never studied it. Rabbi Hirsch would talk about it. Be appropriate for him to talk about it. Yeah.
I'm just wondering, to my understanding, if we say that God is both just, and we also say He's very merciful, then wouldn't there almost seem to be somewhat of a contradiction of these things, especially if we consider mercy to be almost a suspension of justice?
Well, I think you're right. Mercy is a suspension by justice by definition. Mercy always says, don't do what pure justice would require. Now, the question of contradiction can be solved in at least 2 different ways. One is that indeed, if you are operating with pure and complete justice as one concept, and pure and complete mercy as a different concept, then you will have very often contradictory outcomes. Not always, but very often contradictory outcomes. But there can be specific trigger conditions. Mercy is involved in avoiding a loss of type A and not involved in avoiding a loss of type B. And then it depends on by implementing strict justice, what type of loss is going to be incurred. And you know which one to employ. That's one easy way to avoid the contradiction. And indeed, we have seen that, I've mentioned on a number of occasions, that when it's a question of allowing free will to dictate an outcome which otherwise wouldn't be tolerated and is going to be tolerated only because the cause is free will, So there's a loss to what would have been the outcome without the free will. The question is what kind of loss it will be. If it will violate strict justice to allow free will to operate, then free will be stopped and justice will prevail. If it will prevent mercy from operating, then free will prevail and overwhelm mercy. So that kind of way of making them consistent is the natural way to answer any question or contradiction. A more subtle way of doing it is that both are operating simultaneously, and justice is being manipulated by mercy to achieve an outcome of that mercy dictates using the procedures of justice. And that means it's a kind of subtle, I guess you could call it subversion of the justice, where it doesn't do what it would be doing if it were operating on its own. And that's another way of engineering a reconciliation. And there are probably other ways as well. But both of those are used in Jewish sources.
And can this be reconciled to the claim if we say that God is both maximally just and also maximally merciful?
If maximally means using the complete, pure, and unlimited concepts of each, that's what maximal means. Maximal is too vague to mean anything. If that's what you intend by it, then no, I don't think you can make them consistent. Yeah.
So, is Shabbos a kind of like celebration or like token reminder, it's a bad way to put it, of the stillness before creation? And is it meant to be like the pair for the Jewish people because they're supposed to be like the peak of existence, that at its most active and bustling?
Okay, man, we're back to poetry. Okay, the stillness before creation. Strictly speaking, the words before creation are nonsensical because time is part of what is created. Time comes into existence with the creation. So before means earlier in time, which means there's a time independent of creation, and we don't believe in that. So don't get rid of this before creation business. And when you see it in our sources, it means independently of, in logical terms, or causal terms. It doesn't mean before on a clock in terms of time. And the Shabbos is crucial that it comes at the end of the sequence, not before the sequence. After all, the strict meaning of the word Shabbos is no, it's not rest. What else? Sitting? No, you don't have to be sitting down. What else? Shabbos means cessation, to stop. In modern Hebrew, the word for a strike is shvita, which does carry the assumption that beforehand the workers were working, which might not be true, but okay, that's what it's used. A shvita, Shabbos is a cessation. You can only cease what you were doing before. So you can't start with a quietness before. Right? Shabbos is a celebration of stopping something. So it can't come before the creation. Yeah. No? Who else? Yeah.
There's a part of Judaism which, at least for me, often seems just particularly vexing, which is just the idea that so much of what we understand living as a Jew and exercising free will to do what Hashem wants, so much of that we understand as working to counter our natural desires, our natural inclinations, our natural, tendencies, and to constantly be at battle between our animal selves and exercising free will to choose a higher, good, correct path. Sometimes it seems to be an untenable way of life, especially seeing as God created us as creatures of emotions, and then seemingly paradoxically, we in Judaism do not say to ignore those all the many parts of you and inclinations that God put in you. We don't say that they're totally to be dismissed and not valid parts of yourself. So, trying to live this balance of being creatures that constantly do battle against ourselves, while also trying to understand that
but we're not supposed to constantly battle ourselves and we're supposed to take ourselves and our whims and all the parts of us. Those are things that God created for a reason, and they should be listened to a degree. It becomes very hard to understand. What do you want from me, God? You know?
Okay,
And it becomes very hard to live that life. It just sometimes you just want to blow up sometimes.
Okay, well that's probably just an emotional reaction, which the rest of us,
But emotions are real.
they are, but your talk about them should be talk, not emotion. You're trying to express in words a question, right? You didn't come in just to moan. You came in to express a question in words. So the words should have ideas behind them. The words can describe emotions, but they're words, not emotions. And some of what your problem is due to is exaggerating some of the principles that you're dealing with. God created in me, therefore I shouldn't fight it because God created in me? Or it must have something I should listen to and follow because God created it in me? I wonder, what about the evil inclination? God created that also. Does that mean, yeah, listen to 50% of God created him, right? So clearly he wants me to listen to him. Otherwise, why would he create him? No, the evil inclination is created, so you should say no consistently. Not created to be listened to. Just the fact that God creates something doesn't mean you should listen to it. Doesn't follow. Some yes, some no, some sometimes, some under certain conditions, some under different ages of life, different levels of development. But from the fact that God created it, does not follow that sometimes I should listen to it. That's not a good conclusion to draw from the fact that he created it. If you start with that principle, you will create difficulties for yourself that aren't real difficulties. That's number one. Number two, there are people who live challenging lives. Let's take athletes. Some, let's say, continue competing till their 40s. Oh, that's not a whole lifetime. He has time to retire. That's true, but is it 40 years of suffering and tragedy and self-denial and pain and frustration? But they do it voluntarily. Nobody's forcing them to do it. Are they really masochists? They're just out to torture themselves? The self-discipline and the self-control and the focus and the self-denial carry with it also a joy of self-mastery, a joy of raising oneself from level to level of competence and excellence. And so it's not just, it isn't as if you were told, every morning, stick yourself 10 times with a pin and don't cry out. That's your life. Stick yourself with the pin and cry out. No, you can be better and better at football, better and better at chess, better and better at designing software systems. That's hard. You can't take constant coffee breaks and be an expert at designing software systems. That doesn't mean people who are designing software systems are suffering all the time. The very accomplishment of what they create gives them a tremendous sense of satisfaction. So it isn't as if you're condemned to a life of just suffering and pointless, meaningless suffering, which is the way you made it sound. That's not true. That's the second point. Now, as far as emotions are concerned, to a certain extent, emotions are created to be overcome. Absolutely. Moses was the humblest person, whatever humility is. It's a long story. Whatever humility is, it's good to get to the end of that. 80%, God created pride, so pride should be used, and so on. Some people hold that, but it's not necessary. Not necessary. Have a ma'od shval ruach. Person should be very, very low in his own eyes. Very, very, say Chazal. Yes, that is something which the Kodesh Baruch Hu expects from us. This reminds me of the people who have problems, let's say, with SSA nowadays, same-sex attraction. And they say, God created me, and he created me with this, and therefore he must be that he can't prohibit it because he wouldn't do that to me. Well, what are called straight people, what do they call them? Cis something or other, could say the same thing about lust, and even about rape. I know she gets hurt when I rape her, but I can't help it because God created me to desire and to be wildly desirous and so on and so on. So what can I do? That's the way God created me. What do you say to him? He created your brain also. You're not created from the neck down. You're also created from the neck up. He created you with the ability to understand and realize that these are wrong things to do and to control yourself. So if the Torah prohibits certain types of sexual relations, the person says, well, then I'm going to be stuck. That means that you have to get used to being stuck. Exactly right. Just like a person who says, I have to steal because I'm only making $85,000 a year. No one can live on that. So no steal doesn't apply to me. It applies to people who are making $250,000. It doesn't apply to me. I'm going to say, no, sorry, you're not allowed to steal, period. So I don't hear any necessity for any of these complaints. Now, a person can say, but I'm trapped. I feel I can't get any joy out of life. I can't find myself. I can't feel any enthusiasm, or I can't freely commit myself to a system that's so costly and demanding of me. That I could hear. And there, no one lives up to all of the Torah completely. That's why Yom Kippur is there for everybody. No one gets a day off. I had a perfect year, so I don't have to keep Yom Kippur because I have nothing to repent for. No, everybody makes mistakes. The greatest people make mistakes. Abraham made mistakes. Jacob made mistakes. Moses made mistakes. David made mistakes. They all made mistakes, which means that we're all in process. We're all trying to improve. I'm not going to do it now, but I have riots that process means you can't snap your fingers and be perfect. You're not capable of snapping your fingers and being perfect. You're only capable of starting a process which will improve you step by step. How far you get was up to a kosher Baruch Hu to give you success. So that's certainly tolerable. But the idea that it's a trapped system and it's unfair in its structure, I don't hear an argument to that effect. Yeah.
When Moshe shattered the tablets for the first time, was part of that breaking up the oral law and the written law? Was that part of what was narrow?
No. Wasn't breaking the law at all. They all heard the 10 pronouncements at Sinai. That didn't go away.
But he had to change the tablets. He had to make an adjustment because of the way.
I changed the adjustment. Kodesh Baruch Hu decided that he wanted different tablets for the second tablets, right? But it didn't release them from the laws. Didn't release them from the laws. Yeah.
So like the tablets were made of stone. We know that.
Yeah.
But they talk about the ark as kind of being God on earth or something. It was like a representation of Hashem.
Wow. Okay. God on earth is a quotation from a different religion, which you can probably imagine.
Well, but like
right?
they say that it, you have like the things in the temple, the first temple. It was like you have the menorah, you have this and that, and then the ark itself was more like God than anything else, or something like that.
Well, okay, that's getting closer. It's vaguer. That's good. The more vague you get, probably the closer you are to the truth. In a certain sense, the ark is like an antenna. To get cell phone reception, you have to be in the vicinity of an antenna. God says at least 5 times in the Torah, I will speak to you from the point between the 2 cherubim on the cover of the ark. That's the point of contact. The voice, so to speak, comes from heaven to there and from there to Moses. That's the connector. It's a communication connection device.
Okay.
It's not God on earth. He sends his messages through that. And that's one of the things that we lost when we lost this.
Where is it?
Well, it's hidden.
Underneath the temple. I think there's like 3 places underneath the Temple Mount.
Okay, wherever it is. The point is, it's hidden. But everything that Moses made couldn't be destroyed. But it is hidden. But that then came. It led to the position where there was no more prophecy, and the 10 miracles in the temple ceased. Well, in the first temple, says that Tosis Yishonim and Yuma. For those who are not familiar with the idea, I've been challenged on it a number of times. So it was a question of disconnecting communication. The real tragedy, an aspect of the tragedy of exile is a disconnection of communication.
But it's still sitting somewhere, and there's still that connection, or because the...
Well, it's not available to us.
Yeah, okay.
Not available to us. Yeah.
Wondering, is there a type of, intuitive justification or reason to why there seems to be slavery permitted within the Torah, specifically slavery towards non-Jews and also the treatment of non-Jewish slaves?
Okay, it's a long topic and it has a lot of details in it, but I'm talking about slavery. I'll point out one idea. This doesn't do the whole job, and the clever critics will say, but you didn't answer this, you didn't answer that. You're right, I didn't. I'm not claiming to do the whole job. I can't do it in 2 minutes. I will offer you something to think about, which people don't usually take into consideration. The ancients, like Aristotle, credited slavery. without any question. Now, what was going on? Aristotle wasn't a brute, and he wasn't dumb. None of our sources say either of those things about him. So, what exactly is going on there? The thought was this: human beings have different levels of realization in life. Different circumstances give opportunity for different types of development and articulation and realization. A certain type of culture maximizes valuable human potential. A person who doesn't live in that culture is handicapped, not able to maximize those potentialities. If you want a modern example, imagine someone in the slums of Buenos Aires who has the talents of Einstein or Beethoven. He's not going to develop them because he has no resources, because there are no educational institutions, because there's no support. And we think, well, that's a tragedy. Look, he had all that capability and it never got developed. What a waste. Correct, it's a waste. Now, there are people who are living in cultures that don't realize human potential. It would be a tremendous gift to attach that person to a culture which would realize that potential. That's what happens in slavery. Slavery, a person is taken from his home culture, which he will not leave voluntarily, but led into a circumstance in which his human potential is developed in an incomparably more valuable way than it would have been in the home culture. And you say, well, but still, what about freedom and what about self-determination? Well, let's take people in our modern society about whom we feel the same way. Let's take people with handicaps. Do we take a person who has an IQ of 80 or who has physical issues and simply say, it's a free world, live on your own, nobody's telling you what to do, drown, starve, steal, well, we have no responsibility. No, we put them in halfway houses, we control their lives, we direct their lives because we feel they'll have better lives if we control them than if we don't. Now, there are fine lines, and there are distinctions, and there are cases and cases, but the concept that some people's lives are so much better off when they're controlled by others, that giving them their freedom is only hurting them. It's not helping them to achieve anything valuable, that we do that. Now the question will be, what kinds of opportunities are worthwhile and important? What kinds of opportunities are not? What kinds are really self-destructive? Does the person himself have to realize it's self-destructive? Or can we realize it for him? Those are questions, I think, of detail. But the category that there are people who are better off being controlled by others and dictated to, they're better off that way, is a category that was common in the ancient world and is common in some cases in our world as well. I never hear anybody, well, we do have it a little bit now, but I think it's criminal. The idea of children to decide what gender they're going to be and what hormones they're going to get and what surgery they're going to get at the age of 11, and the parents shouldn't be told. The child should make the decision on his own. Of course, he's a tool in the hands of a political operative who's going to put it up on his Facebook page. Another victory. So the idea that people should always have self-determination and should not have their lives directed is an idea that no sane person would allow. By the way, those who champion the children transitioning on their own won't allow him to demonstrate against transitioning on his own because he wants to demonstrate against it. That he won't be allowed to do. So it's not a consistent philosophical position. So I think that's part of the idea of slavery. That their lives are better off being slaves than they would be otherwise.
Wasn't there mistreatment? Or wasn't mistreatment permitted against them?
Well, it depends upon what you mean by mistreatment. But for example, injury to that makes any limb dysfunctional, they automatically go free. So I mean, there's of course, if you kill a slave, you're guilty of murder. So there are definitely very strong limitations of what could and could not be done. Yeah.
From South Africa, right, there's just one hechsher there, and that's just accepted. So I'm battling to understand different levels of hechsher. Something's kosher has a stamp, surely it subscribes to whatever, standards that the Torah has set. I don't understand why something would be less kosher than another. What does that mean?
Okay, your words make sense because you are starting with a presupposition. The standards that the Torah set. That's sort of like the rules of football, right? But it isn't like that at all. There are disagreements about what the rules are, and there are more stringent opinions and more lenient opinions. And there are very many cases where, on the one hand, if you follow the lenient opinion, then you have something that's kosher. But if you follow the strict opinion, you get extra credit for following the stricter opinion. So, for example, Sephardim have a higher standard for the kashrus of meat than Ashkenazim do. There's a difference of opinion 800 years ago about the lungs, lesions in the lungs, and the Sephardi authorities took the very stringent opinion, and the Ashkenazi authorities took the more lenient opinion. But Ashkenazim has something called glatt kosher, which approximates the Sephardi standard, and that's considered to be an improvement in their kashrus because they're following the stricter opinion when there's no resolution as to which opinion is right or wrong. So your community has accepted, because of your decisors, your sages, accepted this opinion, but there is this other opinion. Waiting 6 hours between meat and milk, there's a machlokes between the Mechaber, who is the decider for the Sephardi world, who says to wait 6 hours, and the Ashkenazi world of the Ramah. I'll tell you something which might surprise you. Ramah says the amount of time you have to wait between meat and milk is 0. 0. Wash out your mouth and have the milkshake. No problem. Then he says the Ashkenazi custom, the minhag is 1 hour. 1 hour. What a gigantic difference. But the Shach and other Achronim say, for an Ashkenazi also, really, it would be better, he should follow the Sephardi position, he should wait 6 hours, and the whole of the very observant Ashkenazi world has accepted that, to accept the Sephardi Chumrah, because it's something that's logical, it makes sense. We have an authority who's much more lenient, but it's praiseworthy. Praiseworthy, that's what the term that's used, of someone to follow the stricter opinion. So now, when you have a stamp, that means it has passed the standards of one set of kashrus rules. But there are other sets of kashrus rules, and they may be more strict. By the way, this is a response to people who I heard this when I was first becoming frum. You know that guy's a rabbi, and he certifies the kashrus at that restaurant, and he won't eat in the restaurant that he certifies. Did you ever hear such hypocrisy, such cheating? He won't eat there. So why does he say it's kosher? It's a dumb question. The answer is, that's the standard of kashrus that a certain segment of the population wants, and he certifies that that standard has been met, but he has a higher standard for himself. It's a dumb question.
Sounds like he's something more kosher than another thing.
More kosher. Maybe the words more kosher sound like a paradox, almost like a contradiction, but there are standards of kashrus. Let's take standards of purity in a product. I don't know what the rule is in South Africa. I remember in ancient times when we used to read labels to figure out whether the product was kosher or not. Read the ingredients on the labels. And you see 100% vegetable shortening, vegetable oil, right? Was a surprise when someone wrote to the United States government and they found out 100% means at least 98%. You can have 2% pig oil in there. That's called 100% vegetable. They tolerate a 2% additive. 2% is just a little more than 1/60th, right? 1/50th. Bang! It's not buttel, and it's not kosher, and it's treif with a 100% sign on it. Okay, so you have to know what kinds of standards that you want to put up with. What kinds of standards are you living with? And the different sets of standards. Is it more kosher or less kosher? There are those who will say that this is kosher, and those who will say not. If you want to respect the ones who say it's not kosher, you abide by their stricter opinion, and you get credit for doing so. So if a person doesn't do it, you can't call him a criminal, because he's abiding by the decision of some responsible authority who says it's kosher.
He can rely on it as well.
Yes, he can rely on it, and he shouldn't be. I'm sorry, what?
I'm saying you're saying a lower kasher is still a valid opinion. It's another opinion. maybe
Correct.
less strict.
Correct. It means that he's doing the bare minimum. Can't say he's a criminal if he does the bare minimum. You can also ask, well, what kind of person does the bare minimum? Only the bare minimum. Do you buy your wife a gift? Once a year on her birthday. Every year on her birthday, I do. Once a year she gets a gift. Do I give my wife gifts? Yes, I do. Once a year. Can't tell me I don't give my wife gifts. I do. Okay, try to get married with that idea. I'm giving her gifts. I'm not opposed. I'm not cheap, but just lazy. Yeah. Let's see. Who else? Let's go back to the beginning. Yeah.
Like related to my question from before, isn't it true that if something is infinite, it means that it doesn't have a beginning? And then if it doesn't have a beginning, how can it have a creator?
No, it does not mean that. How many whole numbers are there? Start with 1 and tell me, where does it stop?
Never stops.
Never stops. That means it's infinite, right?
I mean, in that case, there's a beginning, isn't there? I guess you go negatives and there's no beginning. Is that right?
I said start with the whole numbers. I didn't say minus numbers. Start with 1 and go up. Is there an end to it?
No.
No. Does it have a beginning? Yes, it has a beginning, 1. That's where I started it from. So infinite does not mean it doesn't have a beginning.
So what's the definition of infinite?
What's the difference? Infinite means,
Definition.
the definition is that you could say it's larger than any finite number. Infinity is defined in the first case by having a process that makes a new one out of old ones. Right? And that's, you start with, let's say, the number 1, and the process of adding 1. Now, you can always add 1 to any number. So that process produces an infinite and infinity. The infinity is defined by the process that produces it. Start with 1 and add 1 to everything that you had before, and you're going to go on forever. Okay? Now, infinite will be, the definition of infinity is as big as that. You take your things, pair them off, make 1 for a number. If you do that, it's also infinite. That's one way to define it. So it's called countable infinity. There are bigger infinities than that, but that's a countable infinity. And they all have beginnings.
So when we refer to God as infinite, I guess we're not using that.
Well, to ask them, right? I mean, I don't know what these people who put forth these things. Sometimes infinite means unlimited in any way, no boundaries, nothing constrains it, nothing stops it, right?
Isn't that the definition that we mean when we refer to God as infinite?
No, it certainly isn't, because it's self-contradictory. It's a dumb definition. Let's see, unlimited in any way. Nothing can be denied of it. Everything it should be accepted as an expression of it. There are no cutoffs. Nothing that says in here but not outside. Okay, so unlimited would mean all-knowing and all-powerful, and blue and square and soluble and made of meat and let's see, maybe unlimited should mean it has the quality of being limited, because that's a quality. And you said no qualities can be denied. Everything has to be accepted. Nothing stops. So then unlimited will mean to be limited. And then unlimited means limited. It means it's a contradiction. And it means that you don't have a good definition. So the idea that it has nothing is denied, everything's accepted, everything, no boundaries and limits is nuts. In logical terms, it's nuts. Number 1. And number 2, we're not going to allow God to be evil. So that's also nuts. So that's not a good definition of infinity for God. You could try again. It's not easy to define these things. Yeah.
How does the Rebbe respond to there's some people who ask the question when they talk about God has no limitations. So how does the Rebbe respond when people ask a really silly question like how does God, if God is God, can He create another God?
I'll tell you, I've done this a number of times. I've even done it in writing, but the bottom line is this. When you ask, can God do X? Or can Peter do X? You have a responsibility, and that is the X that you're describing should be sensible. There should be an idea behind it. The words should make sense. You don't want to ask, can God blah? And somebody says, blah, what's that? I made it up. Tell me, can he or can't he? You're from, right? You got to say yes. No, I don't have to say yes because you didn't ask a question. Blah isn't a word. It's not a concept. So if somebody puts in for the X something that's contradictory, at that point I say to him, I don't understand you. I don't understand the question that you're asking. You have to say it in words that are sensible words. Somebody says, can God make a square circle? I don't have to say yes. What I say is, what are you talking about? When you say square circle, nothing lights up in here. It just sounds. They don't describe anything. You haven't succeeded in asking a question if the words that you are using to describe the question are self-contradictory words. So now you asked about God committing suicide? No? What did you ask about?
creating another.
Oh, God creating another God, right. So now let's figure out. One part of the definition of God is that he is the creator of everything. But now, if that means he's not created by anything else, because that's something else he wouldn't have created. So, created God is self-contradictory. It's so contradictory. God is a thing which by definition isn't created by something else. You can't create something that isn't created. That's by just a simple contradiction. So if somebody says, can God create another God? The answer is, the phrase, create another God, is self-contradictory, and that's just, you haven't asked the question. Yeah.
The sign of Revelation is often described as the Jewish people saw Hashem himself or heard Hashem himself giving the Ten Commandments. Maybe I have the words wrong.
Yeah, certainly saw is not right. Saw is not right. But they heard it, yes.
Okay, so that my understanding, and you correct me if I'm wrong, was that my understanding is that a lot of the faith of Judaism can be understood based on this, is that the Jews en masse had a revelation of God himself. And I guess that's really what I'm asking. What was what exactly did they experience that was knowledge or recognition of God himself?
Okay, I think you've asked it well. You started off with words I think that were sort of ambiguous and just treading over a line, but then you changed it to something which I think makes much more sense. Let's try to be just a little literal. You see me, but you know how you see me. My body reflects light waves, and the light waves reach your eyes and then processed by your brain. What you have in you is light waves coming from my body. You don't have my body. You have a signal that's sent from my body to you. Right? So is this revelation of me? Well, yes, sort of yes and no. What you get is something, a message sent from me, but in that message you learn a lot about me. So in a similar sense, a little more abstractly, in a similar sense, Kodesh Baruch Hu creates things in the world. Whether he creates patterns of motion of air particles, which we call sound waves, physical sound waves, that's how they heard it, or it creates experiences in our brains, stimulates the nerves, so to speak, and creates those experiences, or it presents experiences to our souls without the brain's involvement, makes no difference. He creates something. From that something he creates, I have an experience, and that experience teaches me something about him. That's the right way to look at it. And that doesn't mean he has to be standing on the mountain, and waving. God doesn't stand on mountains. God is not physical. He can't stand on the mountains. None of that has to make any sense. So now it's a revelation of himself in the sense that he created that experience in me, directly or indirectly, and from that experience I can learn something about him. In Hebrew, it says, "Utmunas Hashem Yabit," about Moses, he gazed at God's picture. And people say, oh, he gazed at God's picture. God's got to have arms and legs and so forth and so on. The phrase God's picture in Hebrew and in English is three-way ambiguous. God's picture can mean a picture that God owns. God's picture. Frank's picture he owns. Or it can mean the picture that he made, Picasso's picture. Or it can mean a picture of a table or of a tree. It represents in the picture of a table or of a tree. Right? That's three meanings for the word. It doesn't have to be the third meaning. Doesn't mean that we made paint on canvas that depicts what God is. In fact, it's the middle one. He made this picture. And as I said, through this picture I come to know something about him. That's God's picture. Not a picture of God in the sense of representing him. Can't represent God in any physical terms because he isn't physical. That's all you need to. I can't give you more than that because I wasn't there. We were told that that's an experience unlike anything else that happened before or since. So I can't give it to you. It's like the taste of strawberries for somebody who has never tasted strawberries. I can't describe it to you. I can just say it's the taste of strawberries. Get a strawberry, and then they'll have it. But that's structurally what's going on.
There was some message that they all felt from God, which was conclusive of his existence.
Yes, you're saying it very well. The Rambam has a chapter in the guide where he says exactly that. That his existence and his uniqueness were manifest to them in that experience. So much so that the mitzvah to believe in God didn't really apply to them. That would be like saying there's a mitzvah to believe in yourself. There's no command there because I can't escape it. Right? There's no way I can escape it, right? For later generations, but not for them. For them, it was an inescapable reality that they had presented directly in their experience. It's a tough chapter in the Rambam, but that's what he writes. Yeah, let's see what this. Okay, let him go again. Yes.
So, at a certain point, when a person like falls off the Derech of Judaism, a lot of the times, it's because he might have questions. Sometimes it's because he has questions. Sometimes it's because he's just lazy and he doesn't really, he loses faith and he doesn't care. But at some point when he gets back on the Derech per se, and let's say he genuinely has questions and he gets those questions answered, and 2 years after he, comes back to, following the ways of the Torah, he doesn't remember why he fell off the Derech in the first place. He doesn't remember the questions or sometimes even the answers to those questions that he might have once had. So why is it that he was so bothered then to the point where he fell off the Derech, but now he's just not so bothered by it?
It's a very good question, and my experience, the overwhelming majority of cases where people have these terribly disturbing questions is because of some emotional challenge, some emotional disturbance, and they can't admit to themselves that they're struggling because of emotions. That denigrates their self-esteem. They clothe it in intellectual terms. I had a case of a boy. The parents wrote to me about his questions and his difficulties and so forth and so on. And I asked, did your child go through any traumas when he was a child?
What?
Traumas. Right? And he got no, absolutely not. Someone investigated the case for me. Listen to this. The boy had a sibling when he was 8 years old. The sibling had cancer. Everybody prayed for him. He had a remission, then he had a relapse, and he died. The father's a doctor! And he told me he had no traumas. Where is he coming from? What's going on there? The father can't deal with it. He doesn't realize that a child who loses a sibling under those conditions is going through a trauma. The father couldn't handle it. So my experience has been almost always is a question of an emotional push. And you see that when you talk to them and you present them with arguments or answers, and they're desperate not to accept it. Desperate. And they try every trick in the book. You talk about a subject, and you give an answer, and the student says, but, and changes the subject. I'm a trained logician, so I don't tolerate that. What do you mean, but? I answered you, and now you're going off to something else. What about the answer I gave you? Did it settle that question or not? He doesn't want to admit that. So he pretends that he's continuing the discussion, so he has to give up on. That's not an honest investigation. He's not looking for answers. Well, he wants to justify his turmoil and his rejection by clothing it in intellectual terms. I have a certain reputation because of my background, and I published a lot of material. I got an email just a couple of weeks ago from someone who said, my son is under an investigation, has come to the conclusion that it's not true, and so forth and so on. Now, for intellectual grounds. I said, did he look at any of my stuff? No, none. That's an investigation. If you Google any of these subjects, my name comes up. Because of my background of being a professor of philosophy, I'm an obvious resource to read. No, he didn't look at any of my stuff. Is that an investigation? He's protecting himself. He doesn't want to confront the truth. We had one guy who was here who ran out of the yeshiva, and somebody wanted to hold on to him. He said, I'm getting the feeling that I'm going to have to accept that Sinai happened, and then I'm going to be in real trouble. And I don't want to stay. I don't want to stay. I don't want to hear. Because he knew that he was going to be in trouble. His life was going to have to change. He didn't want to face that. So most of the time, that's what's going on. And my policy is, if that's what's going on, then it's not kedai to talk to the person, because he has a tremendous emotional resistance to admitting that what you say is true. I usually say, read my stuff and bring me questions on my material. That's a show of seriousness. Most of the time when I require that, the person doesn't write back, because either he doesn't want to do it, he doesn't want to face that. So what can I say? Yeah, now listen, it's 9:15 now. If you want to go to the chasana, you should go. I'm not holding you. You should run. I'm prepared to stay till 9:30 because that's my commitment. So we're not going to the chasana. You can stay. We'll talk. But otherwise, those who should go, have a wonderful time. Okay. Yeah. I'd like to stop.
You're not going? No. Ah, really? Okay, so
You want to turn off?
You can turn it off.
So write down the questions that happen now.
Sure.
Just because so come this side. I'll show you. Come this one.
Yeah. Who's up? Yeah. Oh, I saw you didn't ask. Yeah. Go ahead.
I learned Gemara.
Write down the key.
I learned Gemara saying it's better for man not to be created.
You learned the Gemara that what?
It was saying it was better for man not to be created.
Better for men. No, you didn't learn it. You didn't learn such a Gemara. The Gemara says, the Gemara in Erevin, machlokes Beisil and Beishamai, Noach lo l'adam shenivra or lo Noach lo l'adam shenivra. Those are not easy words to translate into English. Noach can mean comfortable, appropriate, happy, successful, some kind of positive thing. And they, Beisil and Beishamai discussed it for 2.5 years. And then they took a vote and they decided, lo Noach lo l'adam shenivra. It's not Noach for people that they should be created. Now, Shmuel Salanter, I saw this quoted by Rav Dessler, said, in my book of the Torah, in the Genesis story, at the very end of the first chapter, it says, God saw everything that He made, and behold, it was very good. Beisil and Beishamai are not discussing whether that verse is true or not. That's not what they're discussing. If that's the way you read it, cancel it. If you can't understand it, admit you can't understand it. But they're not discussing whether to believe what's written in God's Torah. That's not their subject. Shmuel Salanter said, what they're asking is this. Of course, man's creation is good. The Torah itself testifies to that. But can we see it? Can we observe it? Can we put together the pieces of life so that we can say, yeah, this happened, he did this, he did that, he succeeded here, he failed there. And on total, we see that, yeah, it was good, it's a success, it accomplished something that was worthwhile. Can we see it or can't we see it? They discussed it and debated it. They came to the conclusion that we can't see it. And Dessler says, Salanter says, there's a big difference, there's a practical difference here. Because if we could see how lives succeed, then we could chart our progress by trying to imitate what makes a life succeed. We could be drawn by the ideal to improve ourselves. But if we can't see that, then our progress has to be made negatively. We know what's bad, we know what's destructive, we know what detracts. So we could avoid those things. But to be drawn by the positive picture, we don't have a positive picture. So it makes a big difference in your whole attitude towards your self-development. That's what they were talking about. This is a good example of how you can't we talk about not taking something out of context. And we say, oh, of course, we won't do that. We know that's wrong. You know it's wrong, but you do it anyway because you don't know what the context is. And sometimes you just have to stop and think, what else do I know that's relevant to this subject? And then try to figure out whether what I'm saying makes sense or not. I had someone who, this is many, many years ago, who said to me, non-Jews are animals. I said, what? What are you talking about? Yeah, non-Jews are animals. I thought, I know. He's reading the Tanya. And the Tanya talks about the animal soul and the spiritual soul. There's the Gottleib in heaven. The animal soul made a spiritual soul. Okay. I figured out where he's coming from. I said, well, last I checked, cows don't go into the world to come. But non-Jews can. And the last I checked, cows don't have mitzvos. But non-Jews have mitzvos, and they're rewarded and punished on the basis of the commandments that are addressed to them. And the last I checked, the cow can't become a Jew. But a non-Jew can become a Jew. So, really? Non-Jews are animals? I'd be like, where are you coming from? And I told him where he's coming from. You're coming from absolute ignorance. The only book you ever opened was the Tanya. But the author of the Tanya knew everything. He knew everything. So what he wrote in the context of everything else. And you're taking what he wrote one page at a time. You're not going to understand what he meant. You think that helped? Didn't help at all. He said to me, you just say what you say because you spend most of your day with Goyim. You got used to it. You get used to a dog also. So I couldn't, but that's an example of not taking into account the obvious context. Here, the context is the whole of the Talmud, the whole of the Midrash, the whole of all the oral sources that have been written down since then, and he had no clue. So you got to be careful. Yeah.
So, a few weeks ago, I asked you if the outcomes that could result in, or I tried to ask you, the outcomes that result in creation's fulfillment, whether they could vary in degree of good or bad. So what you offered was interesting. It was this idea that, well, it's always going to be completing a certain sum. So if the goal at Gan Eden is 80%, you have to complete the extra 20%, and you might be able to do that by falling into exile and into the world and then making up the distance, and you might even be able to save some of the progress you made in Gan Eden. But I guess what I'm curious about is, even though all those paths complete the sum, are some of those paths preferable? And then if they're preferable, in what regard do they potentially increase Hashem's satisfaction with creation if we select a route that is ideal?
Okay, these are good questions. These are very good questions. By the way, it's interesting that you should mention that. I spent Shabbos a week ago with a Talmud of mine, and I was mentioning this subject to him, and I told him what I told you then. And he showed me in the Adir B'Marom, which is one of the greatest works of the Ramchal, where he discusses this directly. And he has a different solution to the problem. His solution is that Adam, had he succeeded in the challenge of the tree of knowledge, would have solved the problem of the creation in one joint general effort, which would have erased the problem entirely. By failing the tree of knowledge, the result was that the problem broke up into a myriad of details, each one of which has to be conquered separately. But in the end, you have a certain element in the world that has to be rectified, and the end, either way, is that the totality of that item gets rectified. So the amount of improvement, so to speak, from the initial condition is going to be identical both ways. That's another way which it was done. Rebbetzin suggested a third way which is done, but they all have the same thing in common. That the amount of improvement that takes place is right. Now, I think that one way you ask, so why is one preferable than the other? And the answer is because of the procedure in which it takes. And the simple way to understand is to think of it like a parent with a child. Let's say you want your child to be impervious to temptation to drugs. Drugs are done widely, and you're going to send him to university, which is a terrible, terrible mistake. But okay, you're going to do it anyway, and you don't want him to fall into drugs. And you want him, by the time he goes to college, to be in a psychological state where he's not going to give in to the temptation of drugs. There are at least two different ways to achieve this. One is to put him through position of temptation of various kinds, and to make him face the temptation, and he makes good decisions in every case, and you reinforce him and reward him to the point where he's absolutely committed to not giving in to temptation. And the other is where he makes choices which are bad choices, and he suffers the consequences of his choices, and he comes to realize that the choices are terrible choices, and by the time he goes through that process, he's also impervious because he's been there, done that, and doesn't want it again. Right? The only nafkamina is how much he suffers. That's the only difference, how much he suffers. If you love your child, you would hope that he would follow the first path rather than the second path. But the goal of the whole project is to get him to the position where he's impervious to the temptation for drugs. And in both cases, you get him to that goal. So there's a secondary consideration of doing it in a way that's less painful for the child, because you as a parent wanted to have a less painful life. But that's how shall I say? It's an adverb rather than a verb. It's it's something which doesn't affect the outcome, and the outcome is, from our point of view, the preparation for an eternity of a certain type of ideal existence. So in comparing any finite sum against eternity, it weighs zero. So it's just a preference that the child shouldn't suffer as much in getting to the goal. That's all. That's not a full answer to your question, but I think it softens the question, makes the question much more tractable, much less serious and challenging. And I've been thinking about this for a long time, and my oldest son thinks that these answers aren't really fully adequate, but I think I see that there's much more progress that can be made. My thought of a couple of weeks ago, and then Ramchal's thought, the other thought. It's not impossible to deal with. Yeah.
So this is totally different thing before. Can you offer, please, a definition for infinity as it refers to God?
Well, I don't use the term, and some of the places where you find it, it's translations from Arabic. So you'd have to ask Rabbi Matal, what the Arabic means. I would have to say unlimited in those dimensions where being unlimited is a perfection. But that's going to be always referenced to the idea of perfection. Right. And that's really where you start from. You want to start from the idea of perfection and then work from there to draw out consequences from it. And the other words that you use are not freestanding. They don't explain themselves. That's the crucial.
Perfect does?
Well, perfect means that which there can be no better. And we have ways of judging what's better than what. Yes, you could discuss that also. There are gray areas also. There's gray areas everywhere. But it's not empty. It can't be butterflies. It can't be turnips. So perfection is certainly an idea that we have some considerable understanding of.
Saying infinity doesn't apply to God.
What's that, say again?
What would Ein Sof mean?
Well, first of all, as one, some of them I'm medayek against what you said before. Why does it say Ein Sof? It doesn't say Ein Tchila. It doesn't say no beginning. It just says no end. It only says no end, which means there is a beginning. I think it was about time one of them said that means there is a beginning to understanding God. It's not zero. You don't have zero. There's just no end to what God is to be understood, and you don't get to the end of understanding Him. It doesn't mean there's no beginning. It seems to imply there is a beginning. Otherwise, why is there emphasis on Sof?
Wait, it's Ein Sof to understanding God?
Whatever it is, start off this way. If you tell me infinity means Ein Sof, in Hebrew, in English, infinity doesn't carry the concept of beginning and end at all. But in Hebrew, it's Ein Sof. Why is it Ein Sof? Why is that phrase used for infinity? It implies that there's no end. But since things have a beginning and an end, and only denies the end, it seems to imply that there is a beginning. So the idea that infinity would have to mean no end and no beginning, on the contrary, the very word Ein Sof implies that you do tolerate a beginning. And maybe even more tolerated. Maybe there is so. And this one commentator that I saw recently, don't remember, maybe it was the Baal Tanya or somebody else, who said, yes, of course, there's a beginning of understanding of Kodesh Baruch. Of course there's a beginning. There's just no end. And I quoted to you in the name of the Rambam, where we said, in last week's Parsha, it says, Hareini noas derechecha, show me your ways. Rambam is medayek. The next word in the pasuk after show me your ways is ve'eda'acha, and I will know you. Rambam says, you see, knowing Kodesh Baruch Hu's ways is knowing Him. The verse says so explicitly. So don't tell me there's no knowledge of God. Of course there's knowledge of God. It's just that the knowledge of God that we have doesn't exhaust the God that could be known or is there to be, and therefore there's an ending reality that we can't grasp the end of. But there definitely is a beginning. And the Rambam's diuk in the verse is shocking. It says, show me your ways and I will know you. Right? Go explain it away, wave it away. That's what the Holy Book says. Okay.